industrial neighbors that live with us, not wealth or well-being, but dangerous sludge, PCB, and asbestos in our waters and soils, and ethylene oxide and coal ashes in our air. All of them are dangerous products damaging the health of our community, including not only the adults, but our children too. Most of the people working in these questionable industries are minorities. You see, in the northeastern corner of Lake County, there are towns like Zion, Waukegan, North Chicago, and to a lesser extent, Gurnee. They have a sizable number of Hispanic, African-American, and low-income people. Just to give you a framework for tonight's presentation, I'd like to share some numbers. The population of Waukegan, according to the 2010 census, is of 89,078 people, of which 47,612, a little bit over half, are Hispanic, and 17,081 are African American. So, for Waukegan, 73% of the total population are minority, Hispanic, African American. For Zion, has a population of 24,200 with 7,500 African American and 6,758 Hispanic, for a total of 60% of the population being minority, again, African American and Hispanics. North Chicago's population numbers 32,574, of which 9,746 are African American and 8,857 being Hispanic, for a 57 minority. Gurnee, with a population of 31,295, with 3,665 being Hispanics and only 2,446 African American, has a smaller number of minority people for a total only of 20% of the population. It might be helpful to bear these numbers in mind for tonight's presentation on environmental justice, since it's closely related. So again, Waukegan, 73% minority population, Zion, 60%, North Chicago, 57%, and Gurnee, 20%. So for tonight's evening, I'd like to make 3 brief announcements before we start. Number 1, we want to invite you to the next presentation that we have scheduled for Wednesday, March 24 at 7 p.m. via Zoom. Number 2, we would like for you to consider joining our group to help us make a difference in the types of life that we want for ourselves and for our children. And number 3, please stay after the presentation for our questions and answers session, and we thank you very much. And now, without further ado, we are welcoming the Environmental Justice Speaking Series. Tonight's speaker is Ms. Mila Marshall. Ms. Marshall is an urban ecologist highly interested in sustainability and social justice, and she is also highly interested in the clean water system of our country. So, please welcome Ms. Marshall.
Thank you so much, Luis. Oh, hey, I'm spotlighted. I was like, oh, my face looks huge right now. I was just kind of scrolling through to see everybody's faces and photos. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Mila Marshall. I am the clean water advocate for the Sierra Club Illinois chapter. I began my position in August of last year. and took over from Cindy Screwcrude, who was a phenomenal mentor. And I'm happy to have transitioned into such a welcoming group of people across the state. I can't believe, like, I feel like I have friends everywhere. It's a lot of work to be done. And while I focus my energy and efforts related to water, it does intersect with environmental justice, but I'm happy to have a much broader conversation this evening. You know, we're on the heels of Black History Month, in the middle of Women's History Month. So I just want to say thank you to all of the amazing women who are present here, who are leading the charge within your community. And then we're right, you know, this feels like the longest 90-day party ever, because Earth Month is in a couple of weeks. So it's like we just get to party nonstop. And I'm happy that those months are together, because especially here in Chicago and Illinois, we do have people of color and women leading the way for environmental equity for all natural resources in all sectors, whether that's nonprofit, academia, grassroots or state agencies, and even federal agencies, and the private sector as well. And so I'm happy to join you. I'm going to begin to share my screen. Let's see if everything goes well. All right, give me a thumbs up. Can you see everything fine? Perfect. All right, so I want to start off just with a little bit about myself, but before I do that, I cannot see the chat box while I'm in presenter mode of Google Slides, so I won't be able to kind of get you real time, but there will be some moments in which I transition to introduce you all to some tools and some cool stuff that you can have access to deepen your knowledge about environmental justice across Illinois and even beyond. So who am I, where'd I come from, and how'd I get here? I am born and raised in Chicago. My environmental ethic is deeply shaped by the urban lens. I say, you know, educated from pre-K to PhD. So I am finishing my doctoral degree in ecology and evolutionary biology. Very interested in food systems, but understanding the distribution of stressors that inhibit sustainability, as well as exploring social patterns and ecological functions. So really interested in segregation and helping people understand why it is that human populations that are more similar to each other as they move around the landscape, how that interacts with the ecology of our system. And so I shared some images that kind of reflect me. If you're familiar with Chicago, you may have heard of Eden Place Nature Center. It's a Black-owned nature center on the south side of Chicago, unaffiliated with the Cook County Forest Preserve District. And it was an opportunity for me to be a scholar, grassroots kind of level, and have a place to talk about the nuances of the environment and as it relates to urban African Americans. Yes, there are many other communities of color within Illinois. My research and my focus for my early parts of my career was dedicated to helping us understand issues related to African Americans. Sometimes people think environmental justice issues are very similar. I mean, and they are, but most of them are place-based. And what you see is there are patterns of the environmental injustices that African Americans, urban African Americans experience, kind of different from some environmental justice issues that other communities might face, like tribal communities or Hispanic communities as well, just depending on where they're located in the geography. So we're not all the same. And what I've enjoyed is bridging the gap between various communities, whether that's the academic community, bringing them to the table, the policy side, and helping decision makers understand the environment and how it impacts people. If you have lobbied some of our elected officials, you know that it's like, did you ever go to a science class? Like, do you not understand, our system? So then that's kind of what I do, is I speak up for the system. And that next photo is me lobbying for the Great Lakes and the funding for the Great Lakes with our friends from the Alliance for the Great Lakes. League of Women Voters is, kind of our besties in this fight for environmental equity and social equity. And so I'm able to scale up the conversation and not just keep it focused on African Americans, but help people understand why it is we might want to think about our system in some novel ways that are inclusive of culture and diversity ecologically. And so, my passion, I didn't know I would end up in water, but water connects with absolutely everything. Whether it's farming or industry, whether it's waste or flooding, if it has to deal with food systems or drinking water, it is a really valuable natural resource to help people understand why it is we may want to get a handle on environmental racism and environmental inequity in the Great Lakes and in the Midwest. And so there's a bit of mindfulness that I bring to movement building, because a lot of us operate in kind of these mental silos. We don't necessarily see how one thing intersects with the other. We create these boundaries, maybe because of our missions, maybe because of our funding, that makes it seem as though we're not allies. And as a Black woman and as an environmentalist, I always kind of joke and say, my African American community feels like my sister, and my environmental community feels like my favorite cousin, and they're both dating the same bad dude. And my job is to help them, is to translate the stressor, and help them see each other more as allies than in conflict. We're working towards the same goals, but how we approach them, how we talk about them, sometimes makes it appear as though we're enemies. And so being a woman of color, towing the line for environmental equity, environmental justice, as well as protection of natural resources for all sentient beings, allows for me to approach those conversations and build some solidarity through identifying common stressors and common threats, as well as solutions that favor the system inclusive of people. And so I want to start just by a quick story. I love stories. And this is a story about two outcasts from a village. One outcast was blind and the other outcast didn't have any legs. And they both totally despised each other. But what they did have in common is that the rest of the village did not like them. And so one day they were sitting in the forest, disgruntled with each other's company. And the blind man said, "I smell smoke." And the legless man said, you're crazy. You don't know what you're talking about. I don't see anything. I don't smell anything. So he didn't trust him. And so maybe about an hour later, the legless man peers over and sees flames and sees smoke. And he can see the direction that the fire is coming. And he panics. And so he tells the blind man, like, we're in a fire. I see where it's coming from. But he looks down at his limbs and realizes that he has no legs and he cannot get himself out fast enough. And the blind man also realized that he cannot tell which direction is safe because he cannot see. And so they had a couple of options. They could attempt to escape independently and probably surely perish at some point. They could work together. And so that's what they did. The blind man placed the legless man on his back, and the legless man used his sight to guide them to safety. And I share that story because the common stressor, the common threat, that fire, is industry. It is uninformed decision makers. It is strategies that use a bit of a poverty portfolio or in a sustained investment in equity to generate income that keeps everything in this state of volatility. And so you have the environmentalists and you have, those that are working for environmental justice. All of us are kind of missing something. And what I think that thing is we're missing out on how it is we align our efforts to be in concert with each other, whether that is our funding, whether it is the scale that we work on, whether it is how we advocate for programs or oversight in ways that create a pathway to equitable environments that people can live, work, and play in the state of Illinois, and not have to worry about their lifespan being cut short by 10 years just because of their zip code, for example. And so many people may or may not understand what environmental justice is, and this is the definition that is from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So it is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And this goal will be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which we live, learn, and work. I believe while this is being recorded, I think my slide deck might be included in a follow-up email, and there are active hyperlinks within it. And so if you're interested, you can click on EPA fact sheet, and that will take you to their kind of fact sheet that you can use for any other conversations or information. And so when you go to EPA's website, it's pretty dense, but I do like that it's you can easily navigate it, and we're going to be going there in just a bit. But I wanted to take this opportunity to help you all see just how similar work is being done on the EJ side and on the environmental side, and find the connections. And so a little exercise, I'm actually going to stop. I'm going to go from presenter mode because now I really want to get some comments and people in the chat box. And so from what you see on the screen, I want you to see if you can connect words from the left column to the right column. What do you think kind of goes together? And you can type it in the chat box for me. Which words do you feel go together? So whether it is how we approach problems, maybe you're familiar with a certain landscape that's going through some sort of activity right now. How could you find alignment between the environment and EJ? So Doug, thank you. Doug says food desert and urban agriculture. Direct link, right? So we can talk about sustainable urban agriculture through what? Through soil and having healthy soil. We can talk about it through making sure that there's access to water. Then there's, Susan shares toxins and bioaccumulation, right? So there's toxins in the natural system that impact the health of humans. And then there is the reality of bioaccumulation within the natural world that can cause problems for populations and entire ecosystems. And so another one that's a straight connection for me is asthma and urban forestry, right? Tree cover canopy and using green infrastructure such as urban forests, not just to kind of increase biodiversity, but also to strategically impact the surface temperature of a community, or working landscapes that will protect communities from particulate matter, for example. And so this intersection is where my research exists. And this is where it is that I kind of help people make the connections. As an urban ecologist, I get to turn people's attention to how it is that our exploration of the natural world and understanding of the natural world can totally be turned to use in respects of understanding how stressors move through the human system. What are some patterns of stressors that we can explore in terms of understanding how do we elevate solutions? What are some research questions that need to be asked? Thank you, Gloria. Urban heat island and urban forestry, right? And so you have people on the EJ side that are very health focused, right? Health, well-being, mortality, and on the environmental side, we're still concerned with the health of people, but the way in which we get to it is through focusing on the health of the environment. What is interesting is the stressors that impact nature, how we as conservationists or environmentalists approach it may not be the same stressors that impact people, may not be the same stressors that create the disservices that individuals receive. And so Robin lifted up pollution and bioaccumulation. Absolutely, right? So this, if you think about it, we can bring it back to humans for if water is polluted and that water has fish in it, and the humans in the community fish in that system, right? And maybe they're eating the fish that's at the top of the food chain. The protection of nature on some levels results in healthier resources for people. However, the reason why we're here today is not everybody gets access to those benefits. And there are some reasons why those benefits have not been transferred over to our most vulnerable populations. And my ask of each of, well, maybe not my ask, but I first want to say thank you for being here. Conversations of Environmental Justice have us approach the reality of racism within our society. With the intentional harm that has been initiated and sustained through federal agencies, state agencies, nonprofits. I mean, even our forest services at one time was very segregated. These are things that, while they're uncomfortable to discuss, we have to acknowledge that those of us that are here are solutions oriented. And in order to be solutions oriented, we have to understand how we got here. And if we are not, if we're not in favor of the processes that got us here, then we do have to be willing to dismantle and dissolve the barriers that have prevented equity from existing. And so if you hear anything that makes you feel a little uncomfortable, I totally understand. As an advocate of all things living, I realize that we pick up on feeling shamed or feeling like the problem is so big, what can I do? Or the problem is so big and I didn't do anything, right? But for everybody who's here to help protect nature, and you're trying to figure out where is it that we can build alliances so that all people and nature that supports those people can be healthy, that's a good thing. And so if you leave here today with anything, I hope it's with a sense of awareness that you have a willingness to be a better version of yourself, to understand that there is inequity within the environmental sector, that sometimes it is unintentional, but we have to be intentional with how we remove it. And so thank you for that little exercise. This was important because if we are a society and we're a group that values science-based decision-making, if that's what, I'll ask you, do you feel that as a member of the Sierra Club, there is some value on science-based decision-making, yes or no? And you can type it in the chat box. Do you believe that the Sierra Club values science-based decision-making? So if that's what we value, and we wish to make decisions that result in equity, then on some level, we have to stand up and say, where's the research to help us make the decisions, right? So where's the research to help us make the decisions? And then we have to step back and ask ourselves, are we activating all of our ally pathways as we ask for our state agencies to promote equity, as we demand our elected officials to adopt policies? Are we turning our attention to our academic sector and asking University of Illinois at Chicago, hey, where's the environmental justice research related to water? Are we asking University of Chicago, hey, where's the environmental justice research as it relates to air pollution? Hey, there is something called restoration justice also, like where restorations, oh, thank you, Rosemary, for putting that in the chat box. I feel like I'm always a bit more of a dynamic speaker because everybody learning from each other is really valuable. And I want to hear from you all as well. And so there might be some missing pieces because we're so passionate and we're thinking that these are the ways to move things forward, but who else is not at the table? And what we've realized is that even though we know people of color, poor people are disproportionately impacted due to climate change, you can't find much data on it. So what do we do about that, right? All right, so in the Environmental Protection Agency, there is the Office of Environmental Justice. This organization, or this piece of the organization, has a mission to facilitate agency efforts to protect environment and public health in minority, low-income, tribal, and other vulnerable communities by integrating environmental justice in all programs, policies, and activities. In your opinion, do you believe that we are in a good position when it comes to environmental justice, or that we could be doing more? What is your kind of understanding at this moment? Do you believe we're right where it makes sense, or do you believe that we need to be doing more? Must be doing more? Understood. All right. And I really love Dr. Robert Bullard. They call him the father of environmental justice simply because of his scholarship on the issue. It's interesting when you look at how environmental policies have moved forward, whether it's for air, soil, water, animals, cool. But when you look at the environmental laws and policies as it relates to the protection of people in those landscapes, it looks very different, extremely different. And so absolutely, some barriers to how environmental justice is conceptualized is if you're not in an area with threats, it's hard to wrap your mind around the validity of the threat, right? And so people who live next to the lake are very clear about, the lakefront erosion. Would you agree? People who live close to the lake and people who enjoy the water are much more aware of issues related to Lake Michigan water rising, as well as any issues with the water. And when you're further away or don't engage, you wouldn't even know, right? And so here we get into this issue of what are the barriers to everyone being on the same page. So I would like for you to reflect on, how is it that you learn about environmental justice issues? And if you can type it briefly in the chat box, how is it that you learn about environmental justice issues? It could be as simple as, Sierra Club information. It could be you follow, a nonprofit. How do you learn about EJ issues, whether it's local, through Sierra Club in my church, network news, media? And for those who are Articles News, Sierra Club, so imagine, people who self-select, right? Like you all have identified, you want to be a part of this network. Friends who lived in impacted areas, okay, Sierra Club mostly. And would you, would you agree or disagree that the media covers environmental issues consistently? Would you agree or disagree that the media covers Gloria? Gloria was like, hell no. So a part of me, no, disagree. So two things we've identified that we can begin to work towards bringing into the conversation for environmental justice to be real. One is science and research. Two is, can we please get more environmental coverage on all of the things, right? So it seems as though environmental coverage in newspapers, on the television, it's a dearth of it. And so, one, there's no natural history taught in Illinois. Two, the way that the environment is covered is really patchy and fragmented. So you don't have this consistent understanding. There's all these gaps, right? Yes, LT, catastrophes get covered. It took days for the General Iron hunger strike to get covered, right? There are issues. Centerville, Illinois, took 40 years to that information took 40 years to travel up to Chicago, and it didn't even come through media. It did come through media, but it came through a Sierra Club Kaskaskia group member that read the article that passed it to the clean water team. You all are such a valuable asset in the transfer of information. A lot of what it is that we get and the priorities that we set and the initiatives that we go forward on comes directly from concerned people that pass it on. So we know that word of mouth works, but imagine what it would look like if our society was given more environmental information that was fair, that was relevant, that was real time, that helped them understand the true state of their system that supports them and their business. That's the other scary part, is that environmental justice doesn't necessarily just stay in a Black or brown or poor community. At some point, everyone is impacted. Not right, derailments explode, not even in the news anymore. So what we've identified that journalists and media is in some way responsible for the environmental illiteracy, for the difficulties that we have in helping people understand the issues, and that if you care about urban agriculture, for example, you also care about clean air. And we are more similar in terms of our, in terms of the stressors that we receive, but we do need to understand why it is that Black and brown, poor immigrant communities are the most impacted and unprotected populations within our cities and states. Thank you all for talking back to me. I appreciate it. Oh man. So I wanted to share this because I got this off you guys. This looks familiar to you all, hopefully. So when I was looking up the Woods and Wetlands page, let's explore, enjoy, and protect the people. Can anybody tell me, how this statement came about? Because that came first. Usually people comes at the end, and my heart kind of exploded when I read the statement from the Woods and Wetland Group. Let's explore, enjoy, and protect the people, plants and animals of the northeast corner of Illinois together. Was anybody here when that statement was created? And I'm quite sure there was some conversation just about how do you succinctly, state this, and maybe Doug or Thomas.
I'm not sure how it came about. It's been there quite a while.
Okay. Well, I can say, as a person who's seen many environmental mission statements or statements from groups about what it is they do, it's kind of rare to see and protect the people. And so the fact that you all are already of that mind, it isn't, explore, enjoy, engage, but protect, right? That word is very, very specific. And so my other invitation is to help you all reflect on what that word means to your group, what it means for the populations that you serve within your geography. So Verena says, we adopted it a couple of years ago, can't remember the details, totally fine. I just wanna honor the fact that these types of statements say a lot without saying a lot. And sometimes we may feel like we're falling short, but sometimes that's because of our network. Sometimes there is separateness between networks. We don't know people. Sometimes the organizations have a different mission and we just keep missing each other. And so I also hope that, through this talk, you all are inspired to reflect again on how it is your work through, nature helps protect people and protect the people who need protection, need to be prioritized with protection. And so I want to talk a little bit about understanding the nature of environmental harm. When I got into graduate school and I wanted, I feel like if you've ever done a advanced degree program, you come in with these big ideas and your advisor just kind of chops it down. And I was really excited to listen and share about environmental justice. I was pretty surprised when many of my committee members had never heard of the term environmental justice. And that confused me, because for an urban ecologist to say that they've never heard the words environmental justice, where have you been learning at? But then I realized that this is somewhat an artifact of the legacy of separateness that has been kept between African Americans and whites, people of color and whites within the research and academic community. And so we do need to understand that racism and exclusion permeates through our entire life and lifestyle. I mean, from people of color not being able to get into programs, to people of color not being able to put their names on books and articles and kind of being whitewashed. People of color not being able to participate in, intellectual conversations and purposely being excluded. Now, that's not my experience now, but think about when, 1800s, early 1900s, there was very little, engagement and overlap. And so when I look at the syllabus of a traditional ecology program at a PWI, and the PWI is what does the P stand for? A predominantly white institution. MSI is a minority serving institution. When you look at how ecology and the environment is taught, you don't get a diversity of voices. You don't even get a lot of women's voices. I remember seeing, I was like, oh, so is Rachel Carson the only woman that we're going to talk about in the environment? So it's interesting how they just held on to Rachel Carson and no other woman had, been participating in, in conservation, restoration work. And so we have to understand that while there's an absence of awareness, it doesn't mean that there's an absence of work. And so my invitation to even my colleagues of color is we have to do the work to find the people that have participated in this work because they're not well known, they're not as published, and they're not as discussed. And so I'm happy that more people are talking about EJ issues, because I don't want another graduate student in 2021 having advisors that say, I don't know what environmental justice is. And so some facts, children of color who live in poor areas are more likely to attend schools filled with asbestos, live in homes with peeling lead paint, and play in parks that are contaminated with toxins. African Americans are 79% more likely than Caucasians to live in neighborhoods where industrial pollution is suspected of causing the greatest health dangers. And in a landscape, in an industrial corridor, it's not just the people that are impacted, it's the landscape as well. when I was approaching the studies for urban agriculture, I was interested in looking at ground nesting bees. And so you can use ground nesting bees to kind of discover the quality of the soil, because guess what a ground nesting bee won't do? It's not gonna burrow and make its home and pollute its soil. And so early on in my interest, for my thesis, I was like, oh wow, I could do all these natural observations for presence and absence kind of, or density of. And polluted landscapes don't just hurt people, they do alter ecosystem services. Oftentimes they can turn a service into a disservice even. There's a study also that showed 3 out of every 5 African Americans and Latinos live in areas near toxic waste sites. And the majority of people living within 2 miles of our nation's hazardous waste facilities are by majority people of color. The reason why, I highlighted living, right, is there is a word that I think the environmental sector and ecologists have kind of stayed away from far too long, and it's time for us to talk about it. And it starts with an S, and that is segregation. If we do not understand form, like ecologists study form and function, right? And really humans are part of the system, and you can look at them as communities. And so we know that, you can explore the dynamics of a community, and they have habits that are more similar to each other. And so concentrated poverty and segregation, intersecting, may make our systems look a little different, right? Now, that's not to say that places that are predominantly white or predominantly Black do not have environmental issues, or they don't have a community that is disproportionately impacted. When you scale that up and you take away race, it becomes a class issue. And so you have poor communities, regardless of their ethnicity or their race, being dumped on. And like in my role here at the Sierra Club, helping rural towns deal with CAFOs, which is confined animal feeding operations, many of those communities don't look like me, but they are just as disenfranchised in terms of their resources, elected officials that are taking them seriously to protect the resources that are negatively impacting their lives, and industry is responsible for the harm that is being directed towards those people. So environmental justice conversations have been dominated by the inequity charged up by race. However, in my role, I have to reflect on protection for all. And so I approach that, using the terminology socio-ecological justice. I don't want to take away from the realities that Blacks and Browns are disproportionately impacted, but we do have to let this conversation breathe and fully acknowledge that poor communities in America are not able to stave off miners, they're not able to stave off fracking, they're not able to stave off animal feeding operations, and that is what we have in common. Those are we got the blind people and the legless people, really forgotten by the decision makers of the system, making, giving permits and allowing industry and practices and businesses to exist in ways that are harmful to the system and harmful to human health. And so I want to give you an example of how it is that, what is an example of a community that started off, already in an industrial corridor, and what that means, and how it is that environmental conversations need to be a part of development, zoning, as well as protecting nature for human health. And so the top picture, and in the bottom are references to all the photos and articles that you can go read. Sometimes I share my family's migration story. My grandmother is from Plaquemine Parish, Louisiana, We came up here during the Great Migration. She was one of the first people to move into Altgeld Gardens, which is a housing project on the southeast side of Chicago. And in 1950, they added 500 homes that boasted parking spaces and shopping centers. Now, mind you, less than half of the residents actually had a car. It also was next to Bovian Forest, and the Park District had purchased 15 additional acres. Now, the issue with Altgeld Gardens is that it had already been located in an area that had a slew of factories, landfills, dumps, and polluted waterways. And so you place this low income housing already in a neighborhood that was going unchecked by the state agencies as well as the city. And so the way in which our communities have been able to sustain these harms is somewhat, because of racism and bias. And we have to reflect on, where was Chicago, where was Illinois in 1950? Where were we in terms of how we saw each other? We are willing to risk the health of water and air as long as it is not next to a body that is white. And so you had this air of, it's not our problem. Besides that, we don't really care about African Americans because they're second-class citizens. This ethic, that level of toxic belief, which I believe is the most egregious pollution that kills people, is a belief that we are not equal. Like, that's really the pollution, has allowed for these communities to be under-supported, underfunded, and used as a way to allow industrial development and investment, where the benefits will go to the system, but most of the benefits don't come back down, even though the burden is experienced by the communities of color. And so that bottom picture shows Altgeld Gardens pretty much to date. They also don't have sidewalks. And the alderman has said that, there's no need to invest resources in a sidewalk where there's food deserts and it's shrinking. And so you have elected officials that make certain decisions that also don't necessarily help the community. So Altgeld Gardens is a food desert. It is in an industrial corridor. They do have high rates of asthma and cancer as well. And Altgeld Gardens is a placeholder for every other community that is faced with being located in an area of industry. And so the system, the Little Calumet has 109 miles of river and tributary and drains 213 square miles. All of this fresh water and all of this racism don't mix. The fact that we have allowed industry and we have not held elected officials accountable for stopping practices that impair our fresh water because of the people next to the water blows my mind. And in the Great Lakes, we have 6 of the top 10 most segregated cities. And when you scale it up and understand what the potential threats are for poverty in the Great Lakes, and how it is that industry kind of capitalizes off of that belief that people of color are not as valuable as white people, this system is going to struggle with climate change and people coming in to access our water if we don't get a stronger ethic that no Illinoisan should have unhealthy air, unhealthy water. Industry began in this area in 1870. And by 1890, it was just polluted with steel mills, meat packing, cornstarch and glue factories and foundries. And so very similar to other communities in Gary. The legacy of harm has produced health inequities, as well as little investment has been done to bring in a healthy economy. And very little has been done to push out people who do not comply. Very little has done to that results in people feeling confident that this city is really looking to neutralize some of the negative issues related to the environment. And so environmental justice really came on the heels of the civil rights movement, but it also has, for some reason, lacked that same traction of the attention of both the African American broader community. I'm not talking about the EJ community. I'm talking about the broader African American and broader Latino communities of business leaders, of homeowners, of professionals, you know, to see how COVID ran rampant through our communities and negatively impacted us and the death rates. It felt really close to the 1995 heat wave. And then you see, you know, General Iron's issue kind of evolve, and the people that were active and vocal about the inequities of COVID were nowhere to be found to stop this plant from being placed already in an environmental justice community. And so we see this disconnect, not just from environmental white allies, but even from people of color showing up to help with this movement, which is something that we talk about in our own kind of network of environmentalists of color. And so before I didn't realize we were already at 8 o'clock. What is my time limit again, Doug?
I'm not sure exactly. Gloria, do you know?
Okay, am I good on? I'm
She
good on.
says we're doing great.
Okay, all right. And so I want to pivot to Illinois environmental justice and bring this a little bit broader. And then I'm going to direct you to some resources to understand what's going on in your area. And so segregation remains prominent in towns like Springfield, Rockford, Peoria, Champaign-Urbana, Bloomington. I don't have one. Bloomington, Normal, and Decatur. And so I feel like Chicago gets a lot of the heat because of our population, but we really do need to explore what does segregation look like in Illinois, and how does this pattern of human living contribute to some of the barriers to equity. And so the Prairie State needs protecting, right? And so Illinois has the largest population. Let me pause and say again, we have a diversity of populations in Illinois. There is more information as it relates to African Americans because I am an African American woman. As I diversify my understandings of various populations, my awareness will grow. And so this is not to be exclusive to any group of people, but simply to reflect the foundation of even my environmental justice awareness. And I think we all have to be okay with understanding like, oh, this is where my EJIQ this is where it is, which means that being a Black woman in Chicago in the environmental justice sector, most of my EJ community also looks like me because of how environmental justice is really practiced as place-based. And if I live in a segregated city where I work, live, and play around mostly Black people, my network reflects that reality. And it takes energy to exit that. I was not able to access that until I moved out of the research and into working at the state level. And that's another reason why I took this position, is because I felt that I had more in me, and I need to understand the EJ issues and communities that are negatively impacted that don't look like me, because that's what you do as an ally. You stand up and you show up for the people who are not at the table, and you bring their issues with you. And so Illinois is special because we have the largest population of African Americans in a county in the nation. There's not another state like us. People look at Chicago for equity and race-related issues because of that. And I'm not quite sure, sometimes people miss that connection. But Illinois, just like Chicago, is in the top 10 most segregated states in the nation. I wanna say in terms of segregation, we fall at like, I wanna say 46, which means that we're the fourth most segregated state in the nation. We have water issues that impact various communities in different ways. The picture you're seeing is from Centerville, Illinois. If you came to the town hall, you know that, thank you, Lori. You know that that water that's brown, that is human waste. Centerville is a community that's 96% African American and have been struggling with infrastructure issues, creating this public health hazard. But there's also water shutoffs. There's a moratorium at the moment. Hopefully that stays in place. But even entire cities that cannot pay their water bill that are predominantly African American. Then there's the conversation of blue jobs, fisheries and recreation. So still living in the reality of the 7 out of 10 Black people can't swim as a result of the legacy of exclusion from water and swimming pools, and even accessibility to them, which can be like, there's a swimming pool you can go to, but there's no bus to take you, and only 10% of your population has a vehicle. And I just want to honor Lori's point, add the Quad Cities to your list of Illinois segregated urban areas. Oh, absolutely. So the quote actually came from a report that I'm going to be sharing with you, but you can identify each city's legacy of segregation or gentrification through some American Community Survey data, as well as some other tools that I'm going to introduce you to. There's also the reality of urban heat islands. I don't know if you remember the 1995 heat wave, but it was brutal. My mother was a Chicago police officer at the time. I can remember her coming home telling me that they had to purchase cooled trucks to hold the bodies in. Most of the people who perished in that heat wave were older and African American. And this came from an intersecting issues. Number one, an abundance of impermeable pavement. Number two, lack of tree cover canopy. So there was no opportunity for that community to cool off using evapotranspiration of trees. Then it was coupled with the price and accessibility of air conditioning. Air conditioning was a luxury in 1995. We couldn't even afford the energy bill. I had to stay in my basement because that was the coolest place. And then coupled with the reality of crime, and people were afraid to open their windows or go outside in the evening time. And so you had the perfect storm. And how many perfect storms have we seen that have negatively and disproportionately impacted people of color, right? So it's not that, floods don't hurt everyone, but think about the resources that it takes for a poor person either to evacuate, to protect themselves, to take advantage of insurance, for their property, if they can even have it. So, or afford it, I mean. These intersecting issues is one of the reasons why, promotion of CEJA, the Clean Energy Jobs Act, and for livable wages so people can afford to protect themselves is a part of an environmental justice paradigm. But this includes ground level ozone, conversations about respiratory illnesses, intersects with urban forestry. Chicago is going to be more like the climate of Georgia because of climate change, which means that I think the Morton Arboretum people had said like, oh yeah, we can grow like, peach trees eventually, which will be different, but our zone is shifting north as well. And I asked them, how many of those tree species are going to be wind pollinated? And you say, and termites. Oh no, Rosemary. things I've never dealt with. Marmots, termites, like things that are like brand new to me. Oh, and chiggers. Oh my goodness. I learned about that going hiking. Chiggers are not my friend. But the conversation about urban tree cover canopy and wind pollinated trees. And when I asked the question, they were a bit confused as to what was the driver of that question. And I said, well, if there are high rates of asthma on the south and west side, and you're choosing tree cover on public property that is wind pollinated, and we know we already have high rates of asthma, and Black and brown children are hospitalized or die at a higher rate because of asthma, and we know wind pollen or pollen pollution triggers asthma. You don't think that that's and then she got it. And she had to admit in her talk that they had never thought about it. not one time. And so it was an opportunity to help people understand how to think about people of color and the issues that they experience as a group. Segregation does create this concentrated geography where the approaches to sustainability, the approaches to nature-based solutions, green infrastructure can have the opposite, right? It can help the system. You can capture carbon, however, you're also inducing, respiratory illnesses. And a lot of the conversation about what made that heat wave so bad, and I put it in red, inexperienced city officials. My fear for our state and for our cities, municipalities, townships, is that we have elected officials that are undereducated about the environment. They're not connected to environmental groups in a way that help them connect the dots, that everything environmental ties into other aspects of our world. And before, the environmental threats were kind of acute, we would deal with like an oil spill and then we would go for some time. We would be kind of unaware, but the threat wasn't like looming, it wasn't constant. So decision makers could kind of get away with, oh, I'm not as aware, I don't understand, I can bring in an expert, to give testimony. I don't think that we're there anymore, you all. I think our elected officials are going to have to make some of the most challenging decisions of our lifetime. And they're going to intersect with the environment in ways that can actually induce or sustain harm that creates loss of life. That's frightening to me. So for inexperienced and underinformed elected officials, we need to figure out ways to hold them accountable for their poor decision-making, for their unethical decision-making, such as placing more polluters in areas of high rates of asthma during a pandemic, knowing that air pollution is one of the, the drivers of poor environmental condition that led to, unhealthy people in the first place. We just need to make sure that either you run for office, or we create more pathways to educate our leaders. Rosemary shared Texas power grid with less regulation than the rest of the U.S. When industry and the private sector get to create the landscape of our environmental reality, that's scary. That power is the power of the citizens. And I think the Sierra Club has been figuring out how to activate people, activate our networks, bring people's attention, and create policies to hold people accountable. Yeah, and they thought they could do it alone, which is interesting, right? Like, and that energy, that belief of you could do it alone. Oh, the story. Think about the story. They really thought they could escape that fire alone, and maybe the smoke was really, really far away, and they thought they had time. They didn't have time. And what's so frightening about that is we know we don't have time. There are communities that are in need of support right now, and I feel as though Illinois can really be the leader of environmental justice. We should be. We should be teaching people how to reconcile segregation and promote sustainability. We should have a handle on environmental equity and the funding of it and programs and enforcement. We should have some of the leading industries and private businesses that are looking to invest in more equitable approaches. That's who we should have in our state. Instead, we have people who are coming to capitalize off of our under-resourced state agencies and our elected officials who are accessible to being influenced to make decisions that do not prioritize environmental justice. And then last but not least, there are policies, right? And so this comes down to zoning, development, enforcement, permitting, lack of political engagement. I do not understand how an elected official knows that there's harm being induced, and environmental justice issues have been long lived in Illinois. And to have not moved that needle means that every generation of elected officials just works on, I don't know. You know, it's scary to think that People for Community Recovery came into existence in 1979 to fight against pollution on the southeast side of Chicago. They're still fighting those same polluters to this day, and it's 2021, which is very different from a community like Lincoln Park, who, you know, in 6 years was able to get their polluter out of their neighborhood. And so what that shows us is that industry and private businesses are not above the law, but there's a special group of people that have the agency and the connections to hold them accountable, and they don't look like me. And so that's where allies come into play. And I'm very grateful for Luis's kind of reflection on the wealth within Lake County, because that network is powerful. And if you use it strategically, that network could be responsible for environmental justice being a reality even outside of those counties. So hopefully that's something that will come to fruition. And so this is a document that you can use to understand segregation across the state of Illinois. We have really normalized residential segregation. Segregation in takeaway 2, which is Peoria, Urbana-Champaign, and Danville, have been largely unchanged since 1980. So that's 39 years. Things have pretty much been the same. Black poverty rates are really steep in Illinois. And so you have, you know, African Americans who are poor that don't have, I'm sorry, excuse me. No, I have a quarantine here who decided to start making her dinner, you know, when I'm talking. I'm like, what is that noise? And I'm like, she's like frying tomato soup. And so the reason why, you know, I share at the state level is, again, when we see, you know, we talk about segregation in Chicago and the places that have large populations, but we do know that there are communities across the metro area that have high rates of poverty in their ethnic communities, as well as communities that are predominantly African American and poor. And so there was a conversation with MWRD, for example, where I said, what does it look like for MWRD to serve an increasingly impoverished landscape? And so if these communities continue to become densely populated with poor people, how then does water management look? And how does equity look? And how do you charge those cities when they don't have the tax base? And so they were very interested in kind of perceiving or looking at the system in that way. And that's what is required of us is to be willing to see in different ways that could be valuable for our work. And so in that document, there is something called the White Flight in Illinois map. I really love this map because I'm not going to click on it, but you can go to the link and you go to your, you click this little button and it takes you to some area, Springfield or Decatur. This is for Chicago, and you move the map around and you can click on it and actively see the change in racial makeup of that area by census block. And so when Luis lifted up that Waukegan is 73% minority, Zion is 60%, North Chicago 57%, Gurnee 20%. Oh, thank you, Verena, for my acronym, Metropolitan Water Reclamation District. Those numbers are valuable to understand because people take their ethics with them. And so we understand succession, right? Well, you may understand succession, but you know, things change as time goes along, right? And so when a community is predominantly white, would you agree that there may be shared environmental ethics and environmental goals? When a community is predominantly white, would you agree that there are shared environmental ethics and environmental goals? Yes or no? And you could put it in the chat box for me. Okay. All right. So we have some no's. Okay. Depends on their politics, right? So you might have groups of people within a community that are like, sometimes there's like the green side of town, like all of the people who are really active, maybe they live next to parks. And so when you think about concentrated poverty and African Americans and affluence or other groups, how we engage with the environment is very different. Our priorities are very different. Just as a community, our resources are very different. Our politics are very different. And so when you have diversity within a community, you do have this kind of but when you have concentrated poverty, you may very well end up with a reversal of priorities where the environment, while important, is not what it is that this community needs right now. This community needs its local elected officials to focus on jobs. They might need to focus on policing. They might need to focus on education just because of the needs of the community. And so what you'll find is that as people vacate certain areas, the ethics or the investment in the environment might shift, and that has an impact on the natural environment. Oh, no, I did not notice. This was, you know what? I erased the wrong slide. Thank you for telling me that, Rosemary. I had duplicated a slide and then my takeaways are totally different. Oh, yeah. So the map is good. Don't pay attention to this. Thank you. Last but not least, I want to introduce you to the environmental justice screen. And when I send this to Tom, I will make sure that the key takeaways is the right slide instead of the garbledy-gook. So there's an environmental justice mapping tool that is on the US EPA website. I really enjoy this tool because you can find out information about facilities, you can find out about air quality, and you can just understand what is going on in a particular community. And so mapping provides valuable skills for understanding health and vulnerabilities of populations. You also can take that information about stressors and turn it towards what is the reality of the living landscape. It gives you access to information with regards to stressors to the landscapes associated with environmental justice communities. Gives you a broader understanding of how your community compares to others. And it's free, and it's a free and open source tool that allows for groups and organizations to learn themselves on the software. We do know that as a grassroots organization, resources may be limited. So being able to pay for a consultant might not be feasible. So open source software allows for us to use tools that other communities can use as well. There's nothing worse than working with a under-resourced community in ArcGIS and making maps and then them saying, well, how do we do this? And then it's like, oh, well, this is a $3,000 investment into this tool. And so that's why I really love open source. And so I can just go here. All right, so this link is actually in the talk. The EJ screen tool is a little, I won't say cumbersome, but it is a really cool resource that I really enjoy using and teaching people how to use. And so once you click the button, you can select a location or report unknown geography. And so let's select a location. So you can draw on the site, or you can simply tell it where to go. So let's see if I put in Lake County. And then I go, it takes me right there. And so I'm going to move this box over to the side. And then this box as well. So once you're in the area, There are certain things that you can do, like add maps. You can add shape files. So if you have someone on your team that works with geographical information systems, you can add it. You can create reports with it. No, I don't want side by side. You can create various reports, but what I also enjoy is, where did my little thing go? You can do side-by-side comparisons to look at data in different ways. But you also can learn how to use it. If your group is interested in moving forward with, using the EJ screen, very easy to train yourself. I really enjoy how EPA has made this tool very accessible. And so it has 11 environmental indicators that you can look at. You can look at respiratory hazard index. You can look at particulate matter for diesel. Yes, Verena, there's also a tracker available on Echo. If you are someone who's into permits, I'm going to give a shameless plug. If you would like to work with the Clean Water team on permits for wastewater treatment facilities or CAFOs, we would love to have you. Find it on our website. So this tool can be very powerful. It also can be something to use to relate to other communities. So if you're wondering, like, what is it that I can do with an environmental justice community, or what can we bring to the table? Sometimes it's resources and skills. And so if you do have someone on your team that is proficient in mapping and GIS, and they're a whiz, then the connection can be, hey, we have someone, we would love to see if you all would like to, work with us being trained on it. Let's collect some information. Maybe it's useful for us to, invite a reporter or do a press release. It's, finding ways to work collaboratively and together. Sometimes isn't on an actual issue. Sometimes it's on just increasing people's capacity. And that could be, using this tool. And so, a few takeaways that are not gobbledygook. Environmental justice impacts us all. Our state is in need of people who understand how to translate the harm that's being done to the environment and its impact on people. Our elected officials need a ton of support to become more literate. And our priorities for addressing environmental issues should be inclusive of addressing the legacy harm that has been sustained and induced for no other reason than the people are undervalued. And, when I came to the Sierra Club, I said, with Cindy, we talked about, we're better together. With the nutrient loss reduction strategy and how the stakeholders came together, that we are better together and we have more in common than not. And so as you all move forward in the rest of your year and the rest of your work, consider how is it that you're bringing people along, whether it's the private sector and helping them understand environmental justice, it's the ag sector and helping them understand environmental justice, even your chapter and how it is you all conceptualize your environmental justice priorities for the populations that you serve. And so with that, I will take some questions if we have time.
Thank you. We have several questions and one suggestion from Lori McCullum. She suggests that you add the Quad Cities to your list of Illinois segregated urban areas. We have Rock Island, Moline, and East Moline on the Illinois side of that big river out there. So that was the one question. And I have from the phone, I have received, first of all, a comment, phenomenal, fantastic presentation from Thomas. And he thanks you, as well as asks, what can, and we preface ordinary people, average citizens, white average citizens do? How can we, and this is a two-part, how can we move this conversation to the public square?
Thank you for that question. What can you do? Number one, have a practice of being aware on purpose, creating genuine relationships with organizations that prioritize environmental justice. It's not necessary for you all to completely shift your mission. There are opportunities to work collaboratively and on the interface, because we need people focusing on water. And we need people focusing on water for people, and we need people focusing on people. And so having a healthy relationship with being fluid across that paradigm, but understanding how you prioritize your work could very well be the difference between addressing equity directly or addressing it from the back end indirectly. Intention matters. Your network matters. If you look at who you follow and who you're connected with, you may see some homogeneity in the era of virtual, relationships. It's easy to follow people that don't look like you. It's not so easy to find them. So my suggestion is to go to Twitter or to go to Instagram. And as you find, maybe you Google environmental justice organizations. When you put that in on Facebook or on Instagram, guess what it does? It makes suggestions. It tells you, oh, you want to know Blacks in Green? Here are all the other organizations that are similar to Blacks in Green, and engage. Sometimes attend their meetings just to learn. What else can you do is be translators. I gave a talk about the messenger matters. Some believe that conversations about environmental justice need to come from people who look like me. My argument is sometimes the messenger being a white ally that is their most aware self, their most equitable self, their most connected self is more valuable to that population than I am, because they can see themselves. They can see, oh, this is how I can be. I don't connect with people. I'm not a white woman. And so there's value in connecting with people of color, having the courage to translate with correct understanding to your peers, and hold people accountable, right? Like that's where a lot of the support comes into play. Hold people accountable for their conflicting engagement in the environment. I don't care if it's an elected official of color or a white elected official. If you recognize that that person seems to waver when it comes to EJ issues, make sure every time you get in front of them, don't let them think that you don't know, right? And be willing to stand in solidarity in novel ways to help push equity along. So those will be my recommendations.
Mila, thank you so very much. We are so grateful to you giving up your family time to join us. And we want to also thank all of our attendees and remind folks that we will be here again on the second Sunday of next month with the Journey to the Ice Age Trail. But Mila, thank you so much. We are very grateful.
You're so welcome. Thank you for having me. Bye. I see the little hand clap, Gloria.
Thank you. Good night, all. That was a good one.
Wow.
Yeah, very good.
She is. Oh, you want to stop the recording, Doug?
Sure, that was